Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Zhang and I'm the founder and host of Undocumented History and on the YouTube video podcast. Welcome to episode 23. Currently, the number two best-selling Asian American biography, Boat Baby, is Vicky Nguyen's love letter to America. In this episode, Vicky Nguyen and I will discuss her memoir, Boat Baby, Untold Stories, and her role as a journalist. Here is my conversation with her. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Undocumented History, an online video podcast focused on educating others about Asian culture and history while also amplifying Asian voices and stories. I'm Tiffany Zhang, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Vicky Wen. Vicky is the NBC News daily anchor and chief consumer investigative correspondent, and also the author of her first memoir, Boat Baby. Vicky, thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to join me. Before we start, is there anything else that you want to add regarding to what you do or who you are?
No, that was a great introduction. Thank you for having me, Tiffany.
Yeah, of course. I'm really excited. So, I guess today I wanted to focus more on your book because I know it just came out. So, for the audience that doesn't know, what does the term boat baby mean to you and what is this like memoir about?
So, people may be familiar with the term boat people, and it really refers to the roughly 2 million people who escaped Vietnam after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Actually, today, April 30th, commemorates the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. And so a lot of people had to flee by boat and cross the South China Sea. And my family and I were among those people, but we didn't leave until 1979. So between 75 and 1992, about 2 million people did leave. And because I was only an 8-month-old baby at the time, I was literally a boat baby. And when we look back and thought about what this memoir really encompasses, it is how did a boat baby refugee come here and now work at NBC News as a national anchor and journalist in one generation? I think America is a very special place where things like that can happen. And I think as a mom myself now, I understand the sacrifices and risks that any parent would make to give their child the best life possible.
Yeah, of course. And what was this kind of what was the process of writing this memoir like? Like what was it like revisiting your past memories and stuff?
I was so grateful for the opportunity to write this memoir because it forced me to do something that I don't often do, which is stop and pause and reflect and really talk to my parents and ask them who they were growing up and who they were before they were just my mom and dad. So I'm grateful for that opportunity. And I would also say to anyone listening that all of our parents, our grandparents, if we're lucky enough to still have them, they all have incredible stories about what their lives were like before the internet and all this technology and all these modern conveniences that we get to enjoy. So I would recommend people take the time to ask them questions about what they remember about their childhood. But it can be a daunting conversation to have, especially if you have like multicultural differences or multi-generational differences. But start simple. What were some of the favorite snacks that you ate? What were the games that you played with your friend? What did you do after school? What were the favorite subjects that you studied? And then it can go into, when you were in your teens and 20s and started working, what was that like for you? What was your job like? Who were people that you remember from that time, your good friends, and what did you learn from those folks? I think you will see an incredible transformation in your family members when you ask them about who they were and get them to reflect. And sometimes it's tough, but I would say don't expect to do it all in one sitting, but take the time. Maybe you set aside, 15, 20 minutes on the weekends to do that over the course of time and record it. I promise you'll never regret that.
Yeah, of course. I find what you said really insightful because I feel like a lot of parents, especially people who immigrated from another country, I feel like they might be more hesitant to talk about their stories and stuff. And so, but at the same time, I feel like it's really important to also know these stories, which kind of brings me to my next question. Like, what do you think is the importance of like telling these untold stories and like knowing them and remembering them?
It is crazy to me that Vietnamese people have been in the USA for 50 years, and there's been hardly any reference to Vietnamese people in like the pop culture, right? I was recently asked, oh, tell us about a time when you first saw Vietnamese culture in the mainstream. And I was like, now. Now on social media, I see younger Vietnamese Americans making these great videos about food, about the language, about, interacting with their parents, all the funny things that I relate to growing up. And I see that on social media. But in terms of mainstream media representation on television shows or movies, there hasn't been anything. There was a character on that show, young Sheldon, Tam. He was like the best friend of Sheldon. And that's the only real reference to a Vietnamese American person that I can even think of. So I think even in 50 years, we have a long way to go. I'm actually really happy Boat Baby is entering the chat right now. I hope that someone like Mindy Kaling, if you're listening, will turn it into a series or a movie or a sitcom or something because I think there are a lot of like joyful and hilarious experiences that I had and my family had that everybody could relate to the way that we saw The Cosby Show or Roseanne or Married with Children or Never Have I Ever. But with Vietnamese Americans at the center of that storyline, I think it would be a hit. I'm going to manifest it. I'm going to put it out there. But I think it's so important to tell these stories and share these stories because it shows us how much we have in common. It reminds us all of the things that we share. And I think when you can get through hard times, divisive times with humor, it makes everyone feel closer.
Of course. Yes, I will also be manifesting for Boat Baby to be shown on television or movie. I think that'd be so cool, especially with the story and like all the different trials and tribulations that you went through, but also just like the resilience and also the light in within those stories. And so you touched on something earlier, which is about representation specifically for Vietnamese Americans. And I think in the Asian American representation, increase, I think a lot of that has focused on East Asians, such as Chinese people or like Korean, like K-pop culture and stuff. And so I guess like how can we specifically amplify like Vietnamese stories or like why do you think that these stories have been more focused on like Chinese people or like Korean or like Japanese people?
I'm not exactly sure, but I would say I think probably because we have a longer history of having Chinese and Japanese and Korean Americans here than Vietnamese. Even though it's been 50 years, we're sort of relatively newcomers. We are a smaller country than China for sure, obviously. So I think that's part of it. It's just time, like in the country but also like the voices and the people who can have platforms and who are starting to show up in media. Like Jeannie Mai, I think is a great example. Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's written incredible books. His nonfiction or his fiction book called The Sympathizer was turned into an HBO series, which is incredible. So there are, some more Vietnamese American artists and creators who have visible and public roles. Bao Nguyen, who is a director and just put out a film called The Stringer. So we're getting there. We're coming up, from in different corners, but I think that part of it is just numbers and history. But the time is ripe.
Of course. And I wanted to continue asking you questions about your heritage. So, when you were writing Boat Baby, how did your relationship with your identity change, or how has your relationship with your identity changed as a whole in while like in America and stuff?
I would say growing up, I definitely was aware that I was Vietnamese, but also aware that I was American. And I think as a kid, you want to fit in, and it can be really hard when you don't feel like you're fully one thing or the other. And as a kid, I sort of just dealt with it the best way that I could. In the book, I talk about how I chose the name Vicky and where that came from and how cool it was that my parents were so open-minded. In their mind, I was always going to be Ian, my Vietnamese name to them. So it didn't matter if I had an American name as well. That's not who I was going to be to them. So from an early age, I don't know that I was necessarily aware of the code switching and the like who you are outside of your home versus who you are at home with your family. But you kind of do learn how to move in between all of the different worlds. And I think that helped me with moving around a lot as a kid too, and always being the new kid in school from kindergarten through fifth grade. I was like in a different school every year. And that really, has served me well as an adult to feel comfortable and to be able to adapt to change and immediately be at ease in different groups and scenarios because I just was forced to do it as a kid.
Yeah.
I would say, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
I was gonna say though, like I think as an adult, understanding what it means to be a Vietnamese American woman in the field that I'm in and embrace that identity. It took me longer to do that because as a journalist, the story is never supposed to be about you. You are supposed to be reporting on everyone else. And I would say at the end or towards, when we had the pandemic and we were seeing a lot of anti-Asian hate, I was able to lean more into my identity at that time. I was seeing younger journalists really speaking out against the assaults and attacks that we were seeing on the Asian American community. And I was really inspired by them. And so I felt like, you know what? Why wouldn't I bring more of my whole self to work? And this is enabling me to develop trust relationships with the communities that I'm covering. And so it was really liberating to be able to acknowledge that, hey, I'm Vietnamese American. Um, these attacks are happening to people in my community, to people who look like me. And let's shine a light on this and let's make sure that we're amplifying voices that don't normally get heard. And so that made me feel a little more comfortable about being able to acknowledge that very important part of who I am.
Yeah, of course. I think what you said is super insightful and how you talked about like how being conscious that you were Vietnamese and American at the same time. I think a passage from your book that I really that really struck with me was like when you were like, oh, like I discovered my love for like Hello Kitty and like Cabbage Patch Kids and like and also like Happy Meals and also just like being dessert. Like I think that was such a good passage because it shows like the intersectionality of these two identities. But I think in your book you also talked about how being like female has also contributed to your identity and how like when you were like walking in like your career like people would be like, oh, like that looks like too heavy for you to like carry or whatever. Like how have these like different identities shaped who you are?
Something I think that we talk about a lot nowadays, and people in your generation, my daughter's generation, they're like 8, 13, and 16. People are more aware of their identities, and whether it's their gender, their ethnicity, their pronouns. We didn't have that growing up for me. And in a way, I kind of love that because I think people are very quick to lead with their identity nowadays. And that's not always great because it can be a turnoff to people before they get to know you as Tiffany and all the cool things that make up who you are. They're like, okay, she's a she, he, they, them, this or that. And so sometimes, though, whatever that person associates with those categories is going to shut them down before they get to know you for Tiffany being a person. So what I try to do, and I think it's good advice that I give to a lot of young people, is you are much more than what people see at first sight. And so if you can connect with people on a deeper level on things that matter and are important, identity can be one of those things, certainly, but it's not everything, right? So the things that you can't change about yourself, the immutable parts of you, like being a woman, being Asian American, those are things that when I walk into a room, people are going to know that about me and they're going to associate whatever they associate with those things. So I always focus on the things that I can control, my work ethic, my kindness to others, the way that I, complete my projects. And so I try to bring all of it to the table and not spend too much time focusing on the things I can't change. I work on the things that I can. And eventually, I feel like when you connect with people for who you truly are, those bonds are stronger.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really insightful way to look at that because although I think identity discourse is gaining much more prominence and is also a good thing, I also think that people shouldn't judge too quickly. But
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to ask you about your book as a whole. So, what do you hope people will take away from your book?
I'm so happy the book is coming out now. It is such a love letter to America. It is a tribute to my parents. And I have been getting the early feedback, and the reviews are resonating with people in exactly the way that I hope this book would, which is people are finding joy. They are learning from some of the lessons that I learned. Um, they are being reminded of their own grit and resilience, and that you have a lot of agency in your life. And if you do your best and forget the rest, it's not a bad mantra for getting where you need to go. I think reminding people to just focus on what they can control and not stress about the future and the things that are going to happen that you have no say in, that's actually very liberating. So I do hope people are feel like that I earned their time when they read this book. And I think it's a fun read. I always say like anyone from 9 to 90 could read this book, and I think find something in it that they will love, that will make them laugh, that will make them appreciate their own families. So yeah, I'm just so grateful that Boat Baby is out in the world.
Yeah, of course, and I am too. I think it's such an important story to be told. And do you have any like future plans for like a next book or something like that?
Yeah, it's too, I mean, I definitely, my book agent is like, what's number two? I can't even think that way yet because I just feel like we launched Boat Baby a month ago. There's still so much happening. I want to make sure that it gets to all the corners of the earth and is gets as read as widespread as possible because there are actually some teachers who've reached out to me, which I never anticipated that they would want to share this with their students for a variety of reasons, whether they are refugees or immigrants or international students or journalism students. But that has really made my heart very happy that this could be potentially a teaching tool, not just a book that, makes people feel good and that they learn something from in their life, but that could be a part of someone's curriculum. That's, really exciting and very unexpected for me. And of course, I do really hope that this book finds its way to TV or a film screen in some way, just because I know not everybody likes to read. And sometimes people want to watch something, and I just think there's so much potential here. So my focus is on making sure Boat Baby gets into as many hands and hearts as possible.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you ever do come out with the second book, I'd be really excited to read it. And also, hopefully, I could also invite you again on my podcast to talk about your second book if that ever happens, or a TV show for your first book.
I'd
But
love to
I
come back.
kind
Thank you, Tiffany.
but I kind of wanted to transition to your work in journalism. So, what kind of stories do you decide to like focus on or highlight? Like, how do you decide what stories to amplify more than others, or like cover more stories than others?
It starts with my beat. I am the chief consumer investigative correspondent. So just last night, we did a story on Nightly News about SNAP benefits, these also known as food stamps, but essentially it's government assistance that helps people buy food. And the money comes usually every month on like what looks like a debit card. It's an EBT card, and you can use it to pay for your groceries. And it's loaded with a few $100s. Well, scammers have figured out how to get the information off of those cards, duplicate them, and use them in other places. And so we did a story highlighting that fraud, what people can do to protect their cards, and ultimately what the government needs to do, which is put a chip on these cards to make them as secure as debit and credit cards. And that would drastically reduce the fraud. I mean, more than $200 million was lost to fraud just in 2023 and 2024. And so it's a huge waste of money. It's a huge problem. And ultimately, it really hurts people who are on food assistance and need that money to pay for their month of groceries. So sometimes you do stories based on fraud and government waste. Sometimes we do stories on cool new gadgets and technologies that consumers are using. My umbrella is so broad that really anything that touches your life falls into that consumer category, personal finance, shopping, travel trends. I love my beat because I get to cover everything that affects us in our everyday lives. And then I also, as an Asian American within show, I do try to profile people who are doing really interesting things, trailblazers. They don't all have to be Asian American, but I always love to look for someone who's an outlier and do a story about how they got where they are. And so, yeah, like my stories come to me through experiences that I have in my daily life. I read a lot of magazines and newspapers, and also our producers are always coming up with story ideas as well. And of course, we're following what's happening with the economy, tariffs, credit card rates, mortgage rates. So there is no shortage of topics for me to cover.
Yeah, of course. And I wanted to ask you on that part how there's like a bunch of stories that are able to be covered now with the rise of like artificial intelligence and technology and just like new forms of technology, and with that coming more like disinformation and misinformation. How do you like sort through that information to find like reliable sources and make sure what you're covering is correct?
I question everything that I see or read, and I always try to look for multiple sources that are reputable. And I think that AI actually, with the amount of misinformation and deep fakes that AI is getting so good at putting out there with videos and audio that sound like the real person, I am actually hopeful that's going to push more news consumers to organizations like NBC News so they can verify, wait a minute, what are NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox, what are the big media companies who have fact checkers, who have technology to detect deepfakes? What are they saying? Is this actually true? So I think that's really important for anybody who is a consumer of information to know that you need to verify what you're seeing and hearing before you share it. That's important.
I agree because I think that whether intentional or not, like misinformation can deeply impact someone else's reputation or just like the public's perception of something. And so I think
Totally.
sorting out the true facts of a case is very crucial. And I'm glad that reporters like you and just like other major news sources are doing their best and fact checking and making sure that the things they put out are actually accurate.
Mhm.
And one last question before our interview ends today. Where can people find you on like social media or anything else, or like where can they buy your book?
Thankfully, they can buy Boat Baby anywhere books are sold, and I would encourage people to support their local independent bookstores. But you can certainly go to Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Books a Million, bookshop.org, all of the places. And I would say, please follow me on Instagram. Vicky Nguyen TV is my handle, and I'm happy to talk with anybody who's interested in a career in journalism. I think that I had so many great role models and mentors growing up, and I'm always happy to pay it forward and connect with folks and answer questions. Come to a book talk. Thankfully, that is one. If you know me, you'll know how like hardcore I am about social media and what's good about it and what's bad about it. And I'm very like protective of my daughters and trying to limit their consumption of social media as long as I can so that they have time to form who they are in real life before the world tells them who they are. But I will say what I do love about social media it is that it does make our world smaller. And when people are on there seeking positive content, seeking educational content, we have so much really great information at our fingertips. We just have to be really good about sorting out the bad stuff.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much, Vicky, for taking the time to join me and doing this interview. Such a pleasure, and I learned so much. And yeah, to everyone watching, I hope to see you in my next episode. Bye.
Thank you, Tiffany.